The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey everyone. It looks like we're getting some people in the waiting room here, or um, in the call. So I'm glad to see that. Thanks for coming today. I'm glad that we're still able to run this series and everything with COVID-19, and I'm glad to see that people are still making it out, even though I know that a lot of nonprofits in the province are being disrupted right now because of COVID-19. So it's really appreciated that you're here. Um, so I just wanted to start by introducing, like I have in the past. Well, this is the 6th webinar, so the past 5 webinars. But if you're new here, there will be some new information. So this presentation is put on by Volunteer Alberta. So Volunteer Alberta is a capacity building organization that helps nonprofit voluntary organizations in the province do their work better. So we create resources and help nonprofit organizations by providing knowledge exchange and information, such as the presentation today. My name is Graham, and I'm the Senior Coordinator for the Learning and Development Portfolio at Volunteer Alberta. And this series is part of our 2020 Volunteer Screening Series. So we're on the 6th one right now, and this is the Onboarding and Welcoming Volunteers portion of our series. And I'll just note as well, before we get into kind of the meat of everything, if you have any questions or any technical problems or anything like that, feel free to email Victoria. I think, she's not on the call yet. She told me right before this that her computer decided that today was the day that they had to do updates, so she might be a little bit late. But if you're having any technical issues or anything like that, you can definitely email her. She is just trying to get the webinar software started up, or you can put the note in the questions field in your webinar pane. The chat field is kind of just for us announcing stuff to people. The questions pane is where you can actually interact with us. But for content questions, we'll kind of keep that until the end. So if you have any questions about what we're talking about today, then feel free to type them into the questions and I'll get to them at the end of the presentation. There's also a hands up feature that we've kind of been utilizing over the past collection of presentations. And when we get to the question and answer period at the end, if you use the hands up feature, I'll know that you want to speak, and then I can go unmute you and we can kind of do the question by audio. So that would be great. But yeah, keep in mind that we'll be doing all the questions and stuff after the presentation. So without further ado, I'll just start by introducing the volunteer screening program again. So the volunteer screening program is a collection of different educational and funding opportunities to help organizations develop their volunteer screening capacity. So when we say volunteer screening or just screening, we're very broadly describing the process of defining the relationship between volunteers and organizations. Screening is a really big topic, and it encompasses a lot of subtopics, such as the one we're covering today. But these topics all collectively aim to improve the quality and safety of the programs and services in our communities. So knowing what we mean by screening, Volunteer Alberta provides educational resources and tools designed to help nonprofit organizations improve their volunteer screening processes and procedures. We administer a vulnerable sector check fee waiver for volunteers in many municipalities throughout Alberta. And then we provide microgrants known as volunteer screening development grants to help organizations cover the costs associated with developing their unique volunteer screening processes and procedures. And then the work that we do, it wouldn't be possible without the generous funding of the Government of Alberta. And we'd also like to thank Volunteer Canada, who has provided support and expertise on screening throughout the country, and their screening handbook that they've published with Public Safety Canada. This handbook is super invaluable to us. We reference it all the time, and we crib from it regularly, including in some of the content in this presentation. So if you want more information about volunteer screening, definitely check out that handbook. It's available for free on their website. And then lastly, as we have to state every time, Volunteer Alberta does not provide legal advice. This webinar and our resources will provide some useful generic information, but you should bring any concerns specific to your organization or your work to a legal professional. Okay. So the sixth webinar in our series, it focuses on volunteer onboarding and welcoming volunteers to an organization. When we think about screening volunteers, we often think about all of the preliminary steps that are involved in screening. So that's the pre-hiring and then the hiring process. So that's where all of the presentations have been focused so far. But when we get into onboarding, we maybe get a little bit more head scratching around that, like why is that related to volunteer screening? But screening doesn't stop when a volunteer is hired or matched into their respective roles. Screening, it continues through the hiring process, and the onboarding process, which we're talking about today, it continues even into the volunteer role itself through feedback and support and re-engagement efforts. We also call the onboarding, support, and engagement process the post-hiring process when we're talking about the 10 steps to screening. We reference the 10 steps to screening a lot in these presentations. It's kind of the standard model that is pulled from the Volunteer Canada's screening handbook. It's very useful. And through this post-hiring process, this is where we start to build trust, engagement, and commitment with our volunteers. So that's kind of where some of the importance lies. So what do we mean when we talk about onboarding? Put simply, onboarding is the process of orienting a volunteer to an organization, its policies, and its practices, and also providing training specific to the volunteer role. There's a few different ways to think about onboarding and training, and we'll get a little bit more into that and the exact differences between the two later in the presentation. But for some organizations, onboarding might just mean training. Onboarding for them could be as simple as having a job to be done and then someone to show another person how to do the job. However, for a lot of other organizations, it can be a lot more complicated, involve providing resources, fostering a working relationship, answering questions, and so on. The folks at Wild Apricot, they published a blog on volunteer onboarding in 2015 that I think explains onboarding really nicely. So you can see on the slide here that they say that volunteer onboarding is the mechanism through which new volunteers acquire the necessary knowledge, skills, and behaviors to become effective organizational members and insiders. So I think that that's a really good way to kind of start the conversation around onboarding. We'll dive into the concepts that's mentioned in the slide more throughout the presentation, though. But to preface some of it, I wanted to talk a little bit about how onboarding and screening are related and why onboarding should be considered a part of the screening process. So one benefit that we'll start with here is that onboarding, it can help you retain quality volunteers, which is something that's really important to any organization or volunteer program. So when we talk about volunteer screening, it's not just about matching your organization with somebody who can safely perform the work. It's about making sure those people that you bring into the organization are adequately prepared to fully engage with the organization in a safe and mutually beneficial manner. So it's not just about safety, like it is largely about safety, but it's also about ensuring that you get top-notch volunteers and that you put them in a position in which they'll want to stay with the organization for as long as possible. It may be easy to match the perks and skills of a position to prospective volunteers, but it's harder to deliver those intangible things that make volunteers want to stick around, and that's where onboarding starts to come in. Volunteers, more often than not, they stick around because they feel connected to the organization's mission, and they feel like they can effectively generate impact through their work, and also because they have a good rapport with the organization, staff, clients, other volunteers, etc. So a good onboarding process, it facilitates all these things. It can set you up to better retain volunteers in the long run. Similar to the previous slide here. And I just wanted to note, Victoria is on the call here. She's kind of our tech person. So again, if you're having any technical issues, I just wanted to note she's around. You can definitely ask her any questions if you have anything. And her email is in the chat here, so you can get to her there. But yeah, I'll continue. Similar to the previous item that we have had here, onboarding, it creates volunteer engagement from the outset. So while the core mission and vision and values and the culture of an organization might differ from organization to organization, the outcome that matters the most to volunteers is having an impact and feeling valued. They want to show up and they want to feel like they're actually doing something good. So if you put every new hire through a thoughtful, educational, and fun program, you're going to go a long way towards fostering engagement and then retaining that engagement in the future. We'll dive more into what an onboarding program can look like later in the presentation. The next item here, and this was mentioned in the last presentation as a benefit of the good recruitment process, but it just as easily applies to a good onboarding process. Engagement should be the objective of any onboarding program, not just because it builds a culture and rapport with your volunteers, but because it also builds greater community awareness. So volunteers who are highly engaged, they show up eager to work and make a difference, and they become champions of the organization, and in turn, its mission, its programs, and its services. So they can be brand ambassadors within your community and help recruit other prospective volunteers. And the same thing goes for onboarding. Essentially, in all parts of your volunteer program, if you do a good job engaging your volunteers, it reflects well on your organization through word of mouth and through what those volunteers say about your organization in their communities. Okay, we'll talk about the next 2 points together. So if we haven't stressed this enough, good onboarding and welcoming programs educate and inform new volunteers about an organization and its practices. This is a great time to review your mission statement, provide an overview of the organizational culture, and show volunteers where they fit into the organization. This can help your organization establish trust with its volunteer engaging staff members, and it can it can help retain trust by showing that the organization considers volunteers in its core work. So it helps volunteers and the people who engage them feel like they're actually being thought of. Also, engaged volunteers are the ones who have strong connections with other volunteers, their supervisors, and clients or the community. So many organizations may want to help foster connections between their volunteers and staff by assigning new volunteers, a mentor or a buddy during their first week or two. Their mentor can serve as a resource and sounding board for their experiences during their first volunteer shifts. This type of effort, it can create trust and encourages a culture of collaboration, but it also helps volunteers stay aligned with the organizational norms and its mission. This is a very long way of saying that creating a good onboarding process ensures that volunteers mesh with the organization, both its staff, its volunteers, and its mission. And lastly, it encourages open communication. So when you start any new job, career, or volunteer position, it can be intimidating to share concerns or feedback with about your new role and surroundings. An onboarding program can provide the structure and setting for new volunteers to get answers to questions about their new roles, or their workplace, or their responsibilities without any added pressure. Ultimately, when we look at the benefits of onboarding, the greatest benefit is decreased turnover. Implementing an onboarding program, it goes a long way towards ensuring a better fit right from the start, as well as opening up the lines of communication and keeping volunteers engaged in the long term. Okay. So, this presentation, it uses the increasingly common, but not always entirely understood term onboarding. And when we say onboarding, it isn't necessarily the same thing as training, as we were kind of talking about earlier. It can be. Many people use the terms interchangeably, which is fine, as both training and onboarding are crucial to getting your volunteers ready to engage in their positions safely and effectively. However, it may be helpful to look at training and onboarding as two different activities that work in tandem and accomplish somewhat different things. Because very broadly, they are both methods of getting your volunteer ready to volunteer, but they kind of accomplish slightly different outcomes. So training, it's about developing knowledge and technical know-how. This may be very extensive or very simple depending on the volunteer position and can comprise of all sorts of different activities. As the quote we pulled from HR resolution says, training basically discusses how to do the job. Some volunteer training is as simple as giving a volunteer a 5 to 10 minute rundown of their duties on the day of the shift. Some positions don't need a lot of training to get going, and that's fine. But some volunteer training, it can be incredibly in-depth and involve weeks of classes and mentorship to get the volunteer ready to quote unquote do the job. It's worth mentioning as well that regardless of how your training looks, it should involve some information around safety and liability. It's just like a common sense thing. So making sure that you identify risks and hazards, or even getting volunteers to sign liability paperwork if needed. All of this is good practice regardless of what your training looks like. Even in an office setting, just laying out things like where the fire escapes are is, pretty important when you're onboarding a volunteer or training them. But when we get into onboarding specifically, as opposed to training, it is about getting the volunteer to feel welcome and settled into the organization. So this work may involve things like tours, introduction to other volunteers or the staff, providing food and drinks and other warm, welcoming activities. But onboarding also includes showing the volunteer how they fit into the organization. So this could be providing policies or taking steps to ensure the volunteer can contact you or their supervisor if they need help. It's about empowering the volunteer to engage with the organization when they feel like they need to. And obviously, there's some overlap between onboarding and training activities. You might provide a lot of collateral for the onboarding process during the training process and vice versa. So we think about these two items as complementing each other and working together. Onboarding activities are not always so easy to point out, though, and that's where we start to get into the abstract part of onboarding. How do we communicate a welcoming attitude? When your organization finds new volunteers, it's important to communicate with the right tone and set them up for success. So clear and effective communication, it establishes trust and confidence in your mission. So when we say welcoming volunteers, this is more about the general tone and mentality an organization brings to their new volunteers. So it's great to have an established onboarding procedure and training, but the little things are also really important. This could be just as simple as ensuring that you say hello to volunteers when they show up to volunteer, or keeping an eye out if they need help, like keeping an eye out and seeing if they need help and then offering help if needed. But it also has to do with trust and common sense. So when we're screening, we're trying to tend to community safety and provide volunteers with all the information they may need for a position when they start. But it's also important to know when to let your volunteers be free and work on their own, especially when you're working with like skilled volunteers, for example. And it's also about using common sense to adjust your work when necessary. So, for example, if your policies state volunteers must attend orientation, but something happens and a person is out of town or sick on the date that you're hosting your next orientation, take a second and think, could they attend virtually? Do you have equipment to stream the orientation? Or do they really have to be there in person to be ready to volunteer? Some organizations, that's definitely a yes, and some maybe not so much. Another thing that you might want to consider is, do you have time in your schedule to go over the content of the orientation one-on-one if they can't make it to a group orientation? So these types of common sense things, they can go a long way towards making volunteers feel welcome at an organization. It shows that you're thinking about them. Being welcoming also means setting up volunteers to grow within their positions. So you may have predefined volunteer roles, but if you get to know a volunteer during their onboarding and learn more about some of their passions and interests and skills that you didn't know about before, keeping an eye out for duties and opportunities they may find engaging, and then adapting accordingly, can also show volunteers that you're thinking about them and that you are welcome, or they are welcome, sorry. Mainly, being welcoming is mainly about ensuring that a volunteer feels like an organization is not only just checking off all the boxes to get them in the door, but it's actually treating them like they are human beings with individual interests and skills and needs. Now that we have a good idea of what we're talking about when we're saying onboarding and welcoming, and the benefits of including an onboarding program as part of the screening process, we can talk about the different types of onboarding and training. The first one that we'll talk about here is just a formal process. So a formal onboarding and training process includes things like courses or other mandatory types of training or skill building to perform certain tasks and responsibilities associated with the volunteer role. These are usually paired with more complex volunteer roles, and they should be completed before an individual can begin their volunteer work, or at least the most complex parts of the training should be completed beforehand. So for example, a formal onboarding process might be what you would see volunteering for an organization like the Red Cross or for a distress center. So for example, the Edmonton Canadian Mental Health Association distress lines, they require volunteers go through 64 hours of comprehensive training in crisis management, suicide prevention, family violence intervention, and more before they start volunteering. And the Red Cross, they get volunteers to do 5 online course modules along with with a 3-hour local orientation, and then they have separate operational training for every volunteer role that the volunteer might take on. So these processes, they're very formal. They put volunteers in pretty risky positions. So there's a reason for that. Formal onboarding is also used more for positions that work with vulnerable people, as there's more complex standards of care to learn and understand when you're volunteering with somebody who's considered vulnerable. Informal onboarding is more laid back and approachable than formal onboarding. So it usually includes a basic overview of the organization, of the role, and it doesn't require formalized training for the volunteer to understand their role and responsibilities. These are usually paired with less formal or complex volunteer roles and can be done while the volunteer undertakes their tasks. So it can be as simple as pairing a new volunteer with an experienced volunteer for their first few shifts and then providing on-the-job mentorship and support, or having a welcoming meeting with the volunteer manager and a quick tour of the location. This type of informal onboarding, it can be more appealing to a casual volunteer who just wants to do something simple that they feel is helping the community. And another reason you might have a more informal onboarding process is for project and skilled volunteering. So the volunteer might already have the necessary skills required for the position, and no further training is required for them to be able to do it. So for example, if you're hiring a volunteer web designer to redesign your program portal or your website or something like that, onboarding can be as simple as just first meeting with them to provide an overview of the end results, and then scheduling regular check-in meetings to answer questions. So it should be adaptive. We'll also get into that a little bit farther into the presentation as well. And then it's important to note that it doesn't just have to be one or the other. We've kind of got these 3 categories here, but really it kind of depends. The level of formality in your onboarding and training processes will differ depending on your organization's needs, and that's all right. But if you have an incredibly formal onboarding process and you think it might not need to be so formal, or if you have a very informal process and you think it might need a little bit more, be prepared to start planning to change your onboarding plan to suit the needs of your organization. It's important to note too that every position might need different training and onboarding. So depending on what the volunteer is doing, your onboarding plan might need to be loosened for lower risk positions and then tightened up for higher risk positions. It really depends on the positions as well. Another thing you might want to consider when you're planning out your onboarding and training processes is if your volunteer will be brought into your organization individually or as part of a group. If you're bringing in volunteers individually, you're going to be able to get to know the volunteer more personally, which also contributes to your judgment of their suitability for a role. Obviously, this screening work is largely taken care of before the volunteer is being onboarded, but it's important to remember that screening never really stops. So even when a volunteer has been in a role for a really long time or are approved to start volunteering, volunteer managers need to take time to regularly assess how someone is doing in their role, and it allows for the ability to pivot and change duties to suit the volunteer's needs as you go. Another benefit to individual individual onboarding is that the volunteer can pick your brain a bit more than they could in a group setting. So this is important for complex or abstract roles where the volunteer needs to take more initiative to get the work done effectively. Obviously, though, individual onboarding, it's super time consuming. So a lot of organizations just do not do this, and that's okay because this type of approach, it just might not be feasible for larger volunteer programs. So think about which positions could benefit from this approach and plan to possibly do some onboarding individually for those positions if that's kind of the case, and then the rest in a group. You don't have to do just one or the other. If you decide to do group training, though, you're obviously going to trade off some of that relationship building that happens in individual training. So there's some other clear benefits to group training as well. Group training can create more consistency and ensure that each volunteer is being given the same information. And that's really important. So if you have multiple volunteers coming in and all going through the onboarding procedure together, it helps give people a shared understanding of their roles, and it can potentially avoid confusion created by inconsistent individual onboarding from volunteer to volunteer, especially if you have multiple different people working within your volunteer management team. It can be a little bit messier if every single volunteer is going through a different onboarding with a different person. Group onboarding also gives you a chance to see how volunteers do in a group. So this might be inherently useful for certain volunteer positions. And you may really need to see how a volunteer works with a group for events or positions with a lot of direct interaction with clients. So that's something to keep in mind when you're doing group onboarding. And lastly, group onboarding, it can be a lot faster, which can be a benefit for projects with compressed timeline or if you have a lack of capacity within your team. So. All right, so to give a little bit of an example, for those of you who attended the Developing Policies and Managing Risk presentation, you'll recognize this example of a soup kitchen. We figured that we'd go with that again. It illustrates a good example of what an onboarding and training program can look like. It's something that's somewhat straightforward, but with some associated risks and training required. We've just created it in bullet points to give you an idea of what to include when drafting an onboarding and training plan. This will likely not be your entire plan, but it would be part of the thought process, I would hope. So to start, we've got the onboarding activities. So all volunteers will have an informal introduction during their shift, meet staff, the volunteer team, and tour the space. So having this standard part of your onboarding process is a great way to help volunteers help your volunteers feel welcome. Just make sure that something like this is given an adequate amount of time and doesn't feel rushed. The next one we have is volunteers will be sent the organization's volunteer policies and related process documents to read before the shift. This can be really great to let volunteers know that they're part of the organization. They're not just free labor. And especially if your policies are developed in a way that shows volunteers that they're valued as part of the team. Next, volunteers will have unlimited access to coffee and tea during their volunteer shifts. I think this is I think a lot of organizations do simple things like that, but it's part of being welcoming. Like like what we were talking about earlier, the volunteer should come in feeling comfortable and like they belong. And this is a pretty small way to do that. I'm sure there's lots of other small forms of acts of kindness that you can perform to facilitate a welcoming atmosphere. This is just an example. Volunteers will be sent instructions on how to access free parking or where the closest public transit access points are by email before their first shift. Again, this is a small thing, but it can help form some level of trust when you do thoughtful, small things like this. And then volunteer managers will check in with the volunteer after their first shift to see how they're feeling about the role. So something that this is also something that can be a great way to ensure that volunteers know you're invested in their experience beyond just getting you in the door. So we'll talk a little bit more about feedback and follow up in the webinar later in the month if you're interested in that. That's on re-engagement. But this first day check-in can be a good way to establish a relationship with volunteers. All right, and then we move into training activities. You'll kind of see training activities. This is more, formalized training. So all general soup kitchen volunteers are required to undergo general health and safety training administered by the soup kitchen via webinar or in person before beginning their volunteer work. So you can see here that the volunteers, they do have to do training, but there's some thought about the format of the training. There's the option to view the health and safety training by webinar, which is also a good option for people who have variable schedules or who live far away. But the volunteers can come in person for this if they would like as well. I've seen this done at some organizations where they kind of will have an in-person session that just has a camera and they'll just kind of stream it from the in-person session so they don't have to do two separate ones. All soup kitchen volunteers working with cooking equipment, including stovetops, ovens, kitchen knives, or heavy pots and pans, are required to pass a short kitchen safety test in person, in addition to the health and safety training. So this is where the kitchen starts to require people to prove know-how in person and confirm they understand how to work in the kitchen with dangerous equipment safely. This could be administered before the first shift just directly before the first shift. So there's less travel back and forth for the volunteer and they can kind of, make one trip, do the, test and then go and volunteer on the same day. Next one here, during COVID-19, all general soup kitchen volunteers must attend an introductory session, hygiene practices during COVID-19. So an activity like this, it can be developed as an in-person session for people to attend, even just 5-10 minutes before a shift. So it doesn't have to be something complicated. And then the soup kitchen head chef is required to take a food handler certification course through the Canadian Institute of Food Safety. Course costs and any missed wages up to $200 will be paid for by the soup kitchen. And this might be a big ask, especially for small organizations, but for higher level volunteer positions, this type of onboarding could be the best in the long run to mitigate risk. If anybody gets sick or has a reaction in a soup kitchen, that's definitely a liability concern. So keeping in mind what kinds of risks your onboarding process helps keep in check and seeing what activities could be done to cover any blind spots is really important. And then covering any costs would be an important step to removing barriers to volunteer engagement and making people feel welcome. Okay. There's a couple other specific onboarding issues that we want to go over as well. It's kind of like, we didn't have a specific category for all of these concerns, so we just kind of wanted to hit them off one by one. The first one that we wanted to go over is how to onboard volunteers during COVID-19, as a lot of organizations are now scrambling to figure out how to get this work done, or how to get their work done with social distancing measures in effect. So for most organizations, volunteer recruitment, screening, and engagement, it doesn't end with COVID-19. Some do, and that's quite sad. But if you are an organization that's continuing to go on during COVID-19, you may have to modify your processes, but your organization is still required to be answering the needs of their clients, their communities, and everyone within their organization, including their board as well. So here are some things to consider in light of COVID-19. Number one, assess your current screening processes and consider what aspects of onboarding are required or necessary for a volunteer to fulfill their roles and responsibilities. So if you've been in previous webinars, you probably heard this sentiment already, but it's worth noting again. When screening, it's incredibly important to know what screening processes need to be added to improve community safety and to match volunteers more effectively, but it's also very important to know what screening processes aren't serving those purposes. So this can be a good time to start seriously assessing the risk inherent in your programs and ask your organization what is needed and what isn't. Many organizations, they fall into patterns over time, and it's part of being adaptive and innovative to regularly assess if those patterns are still helpful. So COVID-19 it's forcing a lot of organizations to do this, so don't shy away from it. Also ask yourself, can any of the training be postponed until later without creating risk for your organization, the client, or the volunteer? This is the good common sense note. So most organizations will do training to cover everything for a position. But there are ways to kind of break out positions into duties that do and do not require in-person training or volunteering. It really depends on the position. I couldn't necessarily say that you need to do this for every single position. Some positions really do. They all need to be done in person, and that's fine too. But if they have a position that has like a lot of administrative work and then a lot of in-person work, maybe some of that administrative work could be done first remotely. And then also consider what we talked about earlier. So individual onboarding. This may be a non-starter for some organizations with larger volunteer bases, but if you have the time to do individual onboarding without the large groups and within proper social distancing practices, it might be a good option during the pandemic. The next item we have here is consider going virtual. So there are many platforms for online training and meeting spaces, so like Zoom or Skype or FaceTime, Microsoft Teams, but the training and mentorship, it doesn't need to be limited to in-person. So many organizations are creating online programs and courses to support their nonprofits, or the nonprofits in their communities. For frontline service organizations, onboarding during the time of COVID-19, it may look a little bit different from other organizations. So training and support may still require in-person touch points, but now may be the time to consider how your positions are structured and if there's any way to create virtual positions. Just be sure to comply with the Government of Alberta standards for social distancing and do your part to flatten the curve. Training should include ways to keep volunteers safe, comply with social distancing standards, and recommendations from the Government of Alberta and Alberta Health Services. Okay. The next kind of other onboarding concern, we also wanted to take a quick opportunity to do a bit of cross promotion for our Youth at the Table program. We're not just shoving it in there. We actually have good reason, because youth engagement is actually a topic that's becoming more and more central to many nonprofit organizations. And we decided to include it in this because onboarding and welcoming is kind of a sticking point for some young people. Young people often disengage from volunteer opportunities because they don't feel welcome and because they aren't in fact effectively onboarded. So engaging young people to participate in their community through volunteering can bring new perspectives and fresh energy to an organization they choose to work with. So our Volunteer Alberta's Youth at the Table program, we co-developed a good practice guide with 25 young people between the ages of 18 to 30 to help organizations understand how to engage young board members. It was focused on governance. And although that good practice guide was created for engaging youth at the governance level, we've chosen to share some of the good practices that we believe apply to different levels of volunteering and volunteer engagement regardless for young people. So one of the first good practices we have here, you may want to consider when you're one of the first good practices you may want to consider when you're onboarding young people is to just be genuine and set intentions to engage young people. When we talked about allowing volunteers to grow as part of being welcoming, this is especially important with youth volunteers. So giving young people tasks that reflect their interests and capacities, and then establishing where there is room for them to explore or try other things is really important. So not every young person is interested in just doing social media for organizations. If there's other tasks that are applicable and there's some flexibility in your positions, it can signify a lot of trust to let youth volunteers kind of explore those opportunities. Engaging youth to share their perspectives and ideas is also another thing that we have from the good practices. Creating a safe space for youth to share their ideas and perspectives is imperative when we're welcoming new youth volunteers, especially if you want to retain them. So this could start with creating norms and conditions of agreement for respectful and inclusive interactions. This is a good idea when onboarding anybody, but especially young people. Make sure that part of the onboarding process is establishing how the volunteer or the organization will communicate and interact with one another. This doesn't just have to be in-person interactions, but it could be digital as well. And this helps young people feel more confident to speak up and contribute because often they feel like they aren't welcome to do so. Providing comprehensive orientation and training, as we've kind of gone through this entire presentation, this is kind of true for anybody, but the Youth at the Table team has identified this as being especially important for young people. Young people are excited to contribute and help and try new things, but it isn't a good foot to start on when you don't give them any real direction. So some of the strategies the Youth at the Table folks use to train and onboard youth volunteers outside of the strategies we discussed earlier were including youth volunteers in mailing lists and other internal communications. This helps give youth other ways to feel engaged with their organization, feel like they're part of the community. We also had inviting youth volunteers to celebrations, team building activities, and networking opportunities. So again, this is a way to ensure youth feel like they're part of the team. And lastly, it's important for onboarding to be an opportunity to create dialogue, so fostering dialogue. This is why it can be important to separate out training and onboarding activities, because you may need to do the standard training with a youth volunteer to ensure that they have the right information. There's no special circumstances there. If you need to train them, you need to train them. But onboarding activities can be a bit more of a chance to establish the volunteer's space within the organization and create a channel for them to talk to the organization. So youth's individual needs do not go under just one umbrella. And fostering dialogue with young people will help in hearing their ideas, clarifying expectations, revealing positive attributes, and identifying growth areas. So to facilitate this dialogue, organizations can do things like having a check-in system in place to ensure that the youth are doing okay, or they have a space to ask for help if they need it. And then also establishing systems to provide feedback on the volunteers' work and also their experience in general. So youth are excited to learn about new things and improve their skills. So creating some type of dialogue in which they can kind of get feedback on their work is really helpful. Oops, there we go. And then the last kind of other onboarding concern is skilled volunteer. So as we mentioned earlier in the presentation, that you may need a little bit less training for a skilled volunteer. I wanted to dive a bit deeper into that, as engaging skilled volunteers, as we call them, might be a little bit different than engaging other volunteers. This is not to say that other volunteers aren't quote unquote skilled, but when we talk about skilled volunteerism, we're describing volunteers that work with the organization to develop the parameters of their own volunteer position. So these are people that you bring in for special projects or have a particular skill that you will kind of discuss how to utilize together. This means you might need to outline what parts of your onboarding plan are need to haves for every volunteer, so safe info, policies, etc., and then what is not. So for a skilled volunteer, you may want to stick with just giving them the need to have items and then asking what else they need to get started in their position and then adapting. This isn't just to say you should wing it. Be careful and make room to adapt where it's needed. Okay, and then to finish up the presentation, I just wanted to touch one more time on why this is so important to volunteer screening in particular. When we think about screening, the first thing that comes to mind is all of that pre-work. So interviews, police information checks, application forms, things like that. We don't always naturally think of the post-hiring process as part of screening, but it definitely is. If we think about volunteer screening as defining the relationship between the volunteer and the organization, it fits quite well. When you screen your volunteers, it's the start of a relationship between you and your volunteers. You get the chance to know them and to judge how appropriately they fit into their positions or your organization through onboarding. When we think about who is appropriate for position, there's other things to think about aside from safety. We're thinking about if a volunteer would actually be engaged in the work, or how likely they are to stay, or whether they are the most applicable choice to do the work for the position. And more. So onboarding is a chance for you to set up your volunteers for success and to have a better, more defined relationship with the organization. This is why we think of onboarding as part of volunteer screening. Okay, and that's the end of it. That's the end of the content portion. So I wanted to open it up to questions now. Does anybody have any questions? You can definitely type them into the questions pane. Or if you want to use the hands up feature, I'll keep an eye on that, and then we can unmute and chat a little bit. I'll leave it open for a minute here and see if there's anything that people want to talk about. A question here. Oh, no, that was just an announcement. Okay. It's looking pretty quiet. I hope that means that I did a good job. I'm not seeing any hands up here either. Okay. Oh, and I just saw your note here, Jody, and I just wanted to also mention that there are some handouts attached to the presentation, so if you want to download them, you can. There's the good practices guide that the table put out. There's the presentation, and then there's also a tip sheet that we developed on running virtual events that's attached. That'll all be sent out in the post email as well. I apologize if anybody was here the last time. I was about a week behind in setting that follow-up email. That won't happen again. All right. Well, it's look. Oh, perfect. We are starting a local youth council, so the resource and webinar will be very helpful. Thanks, Jody. Glad to hear that. All right. Well, it looks like everyone's kind of satisfied, so I guess we'll close down the webinar. And if you have any questions at all, definitely feel free to email me at gdearden@volunteeralberta.ab.ca or Victoria v.schindler@volunteeralberta.ca, and we'll get back to you and see what we can do. And yes, our next presentation is on volunteer re-engagement. That's on May 20th, so feel free to come. I'll see everyone later. Bye.